Thank you for taking the time to be here today for my dissertation proposal. The title is a Digital Health Action Process Approach Intervention to Promote Resistance Training Behavior in Healthy Adult Novices. Before I go into any new material, I'd like to briefly cover some old material that's still pertinent to the current study design. So the first is correlates of resistance training behavior. Through the literature review that I conducted and also through the 2017 systematic review by Rhodes and colleagues, we see self-regulation, affective attitudes, intentions, and self-efficacy being related to resistance training behavior. We also see behavioral expectations being related to resistance training behavior in one study. The next question is examining mediation effects. So if we target these constructs and change them, what are the effects of that change on resistance training behavior? And we see interventions exerting their effects on behavior through changes in self-regulation and also through changes in behavioral expectations. This makes these constructs targets that should be examined in resistance training interventions specifically for change. And now we want to know, how is it changed? So that's specifically, how are we applying behavior change techniques to change those constructs? And so what we see here is specifically there have been 3 randomized control trials. If we look at behavioral expectations and self-regulation, we see that these constructs are changed by prompting self-monitoring of behaviors and through barrier identification. That was through Lubin's. And we also see that self-regulation is enhanced by online problem solving, so examining what barriers participants might run into and then making plans to work around them. And also through ongoing encouragement to exercise. Based on these 3 questions, which again, what's related to behavior and what should be targeted, I decided to use the health action process approach as a model to explain resistance training behavior with some slight modification, which included constructs that were related to resistance training behavior, including behavioral expectations and then the measurement of affective attitudes as well. Now, some new material takes that question of how is it changed a bit further. And I was charged with improving study design for a really strong randomized control trial. And so I wanted to know the details. So specifically the details for replication and for strengthening my study design. And this leads into some of the new material. So the first aspect of it is to cover new material, which includes the template for intervention description and replication checklist and guide. And it's called the Tidier checklist. And the next is to cover digital intervention. So let's start out with the Tidier checklist. Now, Hoffman and colleagues noted that intervention description involves more than providing a label or an ingredient list. So in terms of the behavioral research that I'm looking at, it wouldn't necessarily be enough for me to say I'm targeting self-regulation and I'm doing it by doing barrier identification and problem solving. Key features need to include duration, dose or intensity, mode of delivery, essential processes, and monitoring, which can all influence efficacy and replicability, but these are often missing or poorly described in studies. Now, without a complete published description of interventions, practitioners cannot reliably implement interventions that are shown to be useful, and other researchers cannot replicate or build upon the current research findings. So with this in mind, I wanted to make sure that I was hitting each item on this checklist, which I'll describe shortly, in order to have a strong study design. Now, the Tidier checklist was developed to improve the completeness of reporting in order to improve replications of studies. And items that I looked at from that checklist were a brief name, why, what materials, what procedures, who provided, how, where, when and how much, and also tailoring. Now, examine the current resistance training literature in terms of interventions, and I looked at it through the lens of the Tidier checklist. And some things that I noted that were missing, again, there was only 3 randomized control studies, and one of them just provided a manual for participants. So in reality, there were two interventions, which was Plotnikov and Lubin's. That was the primary paper and the secondary analysis. And then there also was a paper by Winnett with a secondary analysis by Williams. And what was missing from the Plotnikov paper was what procedures. So there weren't any details on how the behavior change techniques were provided. So while they named what behavior change technique was given, they didn't say how it was given. They stated that personal trainers delivered the intervention, but at the same time, they didn't say what training that the personal trainers went through. And they also didn't describe the mode of delivery. So we don't know what mechanism the behavior change techniques were given to participants. Specifically, we see item number 8 is lacking. So, for example, Millen and Bray only provided participants with a manual. So all we know is that they gave them a manual, but we don't know how often participants were looking at the manual. In Plotnikov and with the secondary analysis by Lubins, they didn't make a mention of when the intervention was given and also how many times it was given. So again, while they did list the behavior change techniques that were provided, they didn't say when it was provided. They didn't say how often it was provided. So we're left to guess if it was a single dose, multiple doses, or when it was actually given. So again, behavior change techniques were not applicable for item number 8 on the Tidy Your checklist for Plotnikov and Lubins. Millen and Bray, they were given a study manual. But on the other hand, Winnett and colleagues went into great detail on all of the measures through the Tidy Your checklist. So through the lens of the Tidy Your framework, the most rigorous study was the one that was conducted by Williams and colleagues, Winnett et al., 2015. So this study provided details for each category in the checklist, and therefore this study served as the basis for replication, of course under several caveats, which included time and also the mechanism of delivery. So our intervention is going to be shorter, and it's going to be entirely digital compared to in-person versus digital. Next, the new things are digital interventions. For this, I examined some of the resistance training literature and also some of the physical activity literature. So several of the current resistance training studies utilize methods other than face-to-face to deliver their interventions. These methods included through telephone calls and Skype. Winnett also used a website for their intervention. Now, meta-analysis suggests that internet-delivered programs have a small but positive effect on physical activity levels, and Good et al. Found strong evidence for telephone-delivered physical activity interventions. Now, there may not be any current resistance training studies that have done solely coaching through a digital platform, but again, due to the current circumstances, we believe that this is the best approach moving forward. With the previous items in mind, I had a better idea of what must be included in a resistance training study, behavioral resistance training study, in order to have a strong design. With all that in mind, I'll move on to the specific aims and hypotheses. My study had 2 specific aims. The first aim was to assess if a digital resistance training intervention plus behavioral coaching based on the health action process approach can increase resistance training behavior in novice participants over the same digital resistance training intervention plus contact control coaching plus contact control. I hypothesized that the digital RT behavioral coaching group would engage in significantly more resistance training sessions than the digital RT plus contact control group. So the primary outcome of my study will be behavior measured in days of resistance training per week. The second aim was to examine the mechanisms through which the intervention worked. This had several sub-aims. So aim 2A was to examine if the digital RT plus behavioral coaching group has more positive changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning than the digital resistance training plus contact control group. And I hypothesized that relative to participants in the digital RT plus contact control condition, participants in the digital RT plus behavioral coaching condition would show more positive changes in those targeted mediators, which included intention, behavioral expectations, and also coping planning. My second aim within aim 2 was to examine if changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning predict changes in behavior. I hypothesized that changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning will be predictive of resistance training behavior at the follow-up time point. And the last sub-aim was to examine the mechanisms through which the behavioral coaching intervention exerted its effects. I hypothesized that the relative effects of the intervention on resistance training behavior would occur through coping planning and behavioral expectations. Moving into methods and study overview, I will start with a brief overview of the whole study and then go into each of its components. Now, this is a 3-phase study that is going to last for 9 weeks. And throughout the course of the 9 weeks, participants will gain access to different materials All coaching in this intervention will occur through Zoom. So that's going to be the actual resistance training coaching, and then also the behavioral coaching and or nutrition information sessions. So I'll start with training the trainers. Now, prior to commencing the study, student volunteers with certified personal training experience will be recruited by the PI to be trained to serve as personal trainers for the study. Up to 3 student volunteers will be recruited as study trainers, and some of the preferable qualities include having a certification through the NASM, ACSM, or the NSCA, and also experience training clients, preferably 6 months or more. Now, once recruited, students will spend 2 virtual sessions with the PI, learning the resistance training routine, standardized coaching cues, and ways to correct common errors that may be observed in each exercise. Trainers will gain access to the resistance training videos and digital training manuals that will be provided to the participants. On our 3rd training session, the student assistants will complete a mock run of the training program to ensure competency with cueing and error correction. Additional training will occur until students are proficient to complete the training program independent of the PI. Moving on to the recruitment protocol, participants will be recruited on an ongoing basis via campus-wide emails. Participants responding to emails will be given a Qualitrix eligibility survey. Screening questions will address the exclusion criteria. Now, participants will be eligible if they're 18 to 35 years old, have no contraindications as measured by the PAR-Q, and be engaged in resistance training less than 1 time per week on average. Now, one question I'd like to propose to the committee, and we can address this once the presentation is complete, is whether or not we include study details and consent or provide element of deception. So what I mean by that is, after they are deemed eligible, should we put in that they may be randomized to either a resistance training coaching group, or they'll be randomized to a nutrition education group, or not include that in the consent and have some kind of element of deception. So I'll leave that at the end for discussion. After participants are recruited, they will go through a run-in period of guided resistance training. Participants need to complete 2 sessions, which will last 1 week, in order to be randomized. Now, this guided resistance training session will have 4 common exercises, so participants will gain access to 4 different routines. Each routine has 4 common exercises, as you'll see in bold, along with rotating exercises. So as participants go through their 2 guided resistance training sessions, they will learn each of the exercises that they will be prescribed in these 4 different programs. Now, the personal trainers will play a video describing the exercise for participants. After participants have watched the video, they'll execute the exercise and receive corrective feedback from the personal trainers. Now, each participant's going to see the same exact videos, so the video cueing is going to be standardized in that sense. Now, since we met, I've created original content, which includes a website, PDFs, and also a guided training videos. All digital resistance training coaching will be conducted in the participant's home through Zoom. Participants will engage in 2 coach sessions separated by at least 48 hours. And again, sessions are going to focus on technique, and participants will also be familiarized with the resistance training application, which I will go into details for you all on that briefly. Moving on to randomization. Participants need to finish that run-in period of the 2 sessions before they can be randomized to either the digital RT plus behavioral coaching group or the digital RT plus contact control group. Again, at this time, participants would have gained access to their resistance training bands and dumbbells, access to the training app, and they'd also would have received Zoom coaching from the personal trainer. Now, regardless of the group, there's going to be some common components that participants are going to receive. So there's going to be 4 common components. The first is access to that resistance training application, which they should have already been familiarized with. They'll gain information on the health benefits of resistance training. They will gain access to our resistance training at home website, which includes that health information along with PDFs of each program. So I'll begin by familiarizing you all with the resistance training application. And this will be useful because this will be one way that we are going to be tracking behavior. So participants go on to the PT Distinction website. And what they'll be able to do is they'll be able to click on their training program. So this would be a training program example. And what they can do right here is they can go to their first routine, they could view it. And from there, they would see all the exercises that would be included in routine 1. Just for the sake of this example, I just have one exercise on here. And what they can do is they can go to add results. And from there, they can write in the weight that they used and the amount of repetitions that they did for each exercise. This is also useful for objectively tracking attendance because it saves the date in which participants engaged in the exercise. Each exercise that participants will do will also have an informational video attached to it. So when they click on this, they can click on the video that has information and technique cues. Okay. Next, I will show you the resistance training in home website. So this is the resistance training in home website. And what participants can do is they can click on any routine that they want to follow. They could also click on this for understand resistance training health benefits, which is also on the home page. Participants can click on the day that they want to do and download the material. So it turns into a PDF that looks like this. And the PDF says what day they will be doing. Along with what the circuit looks like. So a circuit overview for everything. And then for circuit 1, it has all the exercises they're doing along with the link to the routine. And it has before and after pictures which show how the exercise should look along with specific cues for each exercise. So participants can look at this PDF program before they do the routine so that they know what they're going to be doing. Now the website also has guided videos for participants to work through. So they can easily click on the link and follow the program with a trainer. Each video also prompts participants to take out their training app. There's an overview of everything that they'll do. So they know that they'll be doing squats for a warm-up, lunges with a reach. When they get into the actual program as well, it will give an overview of everything too. So that's a brief overview of the website. Again, it includes 4 different routines. It includes PDFs of all of the training programs, gives them an overview of what they're going to be doing, and they can easily follow along with it. All right. So at this point, I've covered the resistance training application. I've covered the actual website that they'll be using, which includes all of those features that I just mentioned. Now the differences between the two groups. So we have our RT plus behavioral coaching group and then our RT plus contact control group. Now the RT plus behavioral coaching group will receive behavioral coaching at the ends of weeks 2, 3, and 4, along with right after randomization. And then the nutrition group will receive information sessions at the ends of weeks 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the digital RT plus contact control group will be focused on education related to nutrition topics. These topics might include dietary guidelines, common diets, keys to healthy diets, micro and macronutrients. And the World Health Organization has several topics that may be useful for this. The duration of this session will be matched for the behavioral coaching session, so they'll be 15 to 20 minutes long. Frequency will also be matched. The number of sessions will be matched between the two conditions. Meetings will occur within 1 week after randomization, and then subsequently on 3 other occasions spaced out by 1 week. You'll see that participants in the behavioral coaching group will get SMS text message reminders of when they said they would do resistance training. In order to match for the contact with the group, this group will also receive SMS messages related to nutrition content. The digital resistance training plus behavioral coaching experimental group will undergo an intervention that's based on the health action process approach. And what we'll be doing is we'll be using a semi-scripted coaching approach. So this will be the template for the semi-scripted coaching approach. Participants are going to gain access to an online calendar that will look like this. So the calendar will have space for planning on the right side, and also participants will have the ability to fill in their daily and weekly schedule. So they'll have a tab for each week. Here's an example of what this might look like on Monday. Participants will be encouraged to fill in all of their known obligations for each day. After they've filled in their known obligations, what they'll then do is look for space when they may be able to engage in resistance training on a weekly basis. So for example, if there was a break between class and doing homework, participants could write down that they'll be doing resistance training then. Participants will also then form an action plan and write that in the planning space. They'll also form a coping plan, so plans to work around any barriers that they might run into. So this one might be, after my biology class on Monday, I will do my day 1 resistance training. If I'm feeling unmotivated to do my routine, I will plan on putting my workout clothes on my bed and set up the video on my computer so that I'm prompted to do this after work. And again, here's a brief overview of the differences and similarities between the groups and also the time that they will be committed to the intervention. So again, all participants will receive access to RTN Home. They'll complete questionnaires, and they'll meet with the PI with differential focuses. After phase 2 is completed in 4 weeks, there will be a no contact follow-up period, which will also last 4 weeks. So after phase 2, participants will be instructed to do the resistance training on their own by following the RT videos or on the app used in rtnhome.com. Again, once again, there will be no contact with the PI during this time period. At this point, we would have measured behavior one time and then the psychological variables on 4 other occasions. So behavior will be measured at the end of the second phase. Psychological questionnaires will be measured at the end of the first session, at the end of the second session, and 1 week after the initial first session, and then at the end of phase 2. When the follow-up period is complete, we'll measure behavior again, and along with all of the psychological questionnaires. In terms of tracking behavior, we will utilize the PT Distinction app because when participants log their results, it will propagate on a calendar that they completed the routine. We'll also measure resistance training behavior more subjectively by using an adapted version of the Godin Leisure Time questionnaire. The psychological constructs, again, that we'll measure will be affective attitude, self-efficacy, intentions, behavioral expectations, and coping planning. Now moving on to the analysis plan. So a recap with the aims, hypotheses, and how we're going to test this. So the first aim was to assess if a digital resistance training intervention plus behavioral coaching group based on the health action process approach can increase resistance training behavior in novice participants over the same digital resistance training intervention plus contact control. It was hypothesized that the digital resistance training behavioral coaching group would produce significantly greater adherence to resistance training. We proposed to use an independent samples t-test we run to determine differences in mean scores between digital RT plus behavioral coaching group and digital RT plus contact control group at the conclusion of the study on resistance training behavior. Our second aim, the sub-aim 2A, was to examine if the digital RT plus behavioral coaching group has more positive changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning than the digital RT plus contact control group. We hypothesized that relative to participants in the digital RT contact control condition, participants in the digital RT plus behavioral coaching condition would show more positive changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning. We'll test the effects of the treatment on changes in intentions, behavioral expectations, and then also coping planning. Aim 2B was to examine if changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning predict changes in behavior. We hypothesized that changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning will be predictive of resistance training behavior at the follow-up time point. We will test the effects of the intervention and test the effects of changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning on resistance training behavior. And the last point was to examine the mechanisms through which the behavioral coaching intervention exerted its effects. We hypothesized that the relative effects of the intervention on resistance training behavior would occur through coping planning and behavioral expectations. And the analysis, each mediator will be tested independently and will be coded with a change score. The treatment effects will be estimated using a series of regression models to examine the potential mediating effects of behavioral expectations and coping planning. Moving on to strengths and limitations. This will be only the second resistance training study which does two things, including names the behavior change technique and also addresses the dose of the behavior change techniques used. Another strength is that we follow the tidier checklist in order to improve replicability. This also relates to the open access of materials. Also, to reduce bias, the study was informed by the Cochrane collaboration tool for assessing bias. Some limitations that we have to do with the novelty of a behavior change digitally based resistance training intervention. With a less controlled environment, there's a potential threat to internal validity. For example, we won't be able to assess via self-report tracking in the training app, and there'll be no objective measure of whether participants engaged in resistance training or other forms of resistance training. And thank you, and we can move on to any questions.